guys so much for coming. This is not a topic that I usually talk about, so you guys might be surprised to see that I've chosen to talk about something not injury related. This topic actually is super relevant to what I do. I'm a physical therapist at Freeman. I love working with runners. That's one of my passions. I'm going to get to that later. But the VO2 max and metabolic conditioning, why am I interested in this? Before I became a physical therapist, I was a biologist. So my background's in biology. One of my favorite classes in college was cell physiology. So we're going to get into that just a little bit. And then I'm going to turn around and talk about why I care about that. And then we're going to get into this concept of, what is VO2 max? Why do we test it? Why are we interested in it? And before we move on, I just want to get a feel for what you guys think VO2 max is. Is it just for tell me your thoughts. What is it for everybody to do?
The definition of it, what it is?
Or no, why would you be interested in getting a VO2 max test?
Since it's the amount of oxygen the blood can absorb in a certain amount of time, it also determines the exercise effort you're capable of doing within that given time.
Okay.
I would think.
Awesome. Anybody ever done a VO2 max test? Okay. This is VO2, yeah, me. So the paper that I handed out, that's we're going to get into that. That's a test that I did with Dr McNab. So we'll go into what all those numbers mean. But I think the purpose of today is to show that VO2 max testing, it is more than just giving you a max number, a max amount of oxygen that you can use when you run and when you exercise. It's a way to look at your overall metabolic health. So how good are you at using different fuel sources for your daily activities, for your running? So VO2 max testing is a lot more than just giving you a max number. And knowing some of the information you would get from a VO2 max test, it is, if you're able to use that in your training, it's a great way to stick with the sport long term. It's a good way to just have a good long term, stick with long term goals for your overall health. So why are we interested in this? That's the first thing we're going to hit on. What is VO2 max, and then how do you measure it? And then how can you use the knowledge you gain from this testing in your training to not only help with injury prevention, but also to help improve your performance and then lifetime fitness goals. There's this concept called health span that I may have you talk about later. So Dr. McNab is a longevity doctor, so he's really interested in addressing health issues early so that you can live healthy long into your 70s, 80s, 90s. It's this ideal of health span that we need to focus on rather than lifespan. And I think we can use our knowledge that you gain from VO2 max testing to kind of have this vision for why you're running, why you're exercising. So just a second. There we go. Okay, so what is VO2 max testing? Henry said it earlier. It is the maximal amount of oxygen that you can use during exercise. And big picture, it reflects your. So why is a doctor like Dr. McNab interested in this? Big picture is that there's a lot of evidence that a low cardiorespiratory fitness is a big predictor of a lot of health issues. So a lot of doctors like Dr. McNab are starting to test VO2 max in their patients because they see that patients with low VO2 max, they have a lot of health issues. So big picture, that's why we should all be interested in it. The thing to know about VO2 max is it's going to get lower the older you get. So the older you get, we start out high, and then you just decline as you get older. However, you can, with the right training, slow the decline process as you get older. So VO2 max is influenced really by two things. It is how oxygen is delivered, which is the heart's lungs, capillaries that go to your muscles, and then how oxygen is used, which is metabolism. And that's why we're going to get into metabolism here in just a little bit. So metabolism is what happens at the cellular level. Anybody take cell biology a long time ago? Cell biology? Mitochondria. So the mitochondria, the picture, those super, super important structures in all of our cells. It's essentially the energy grid, but that's where all the work of metabolism takes place. Turns out that a lot of chronic diseases are related to mitochondrial dysfunction. There is a internationally known researcher. His name is Inigo San Milan. He is the former coach of one of the world's greatest cyclists, Pogacar. Anybody heard of Pogacar? You know, Ryan has. So he's won 3 different Tour de France's, and how old is he, Ryan? He's 20. So he's got a lot of potential. This was his former coach, and Inigo he's a researcher and a coach, and he's got a really interesting line of research. He is super interested in studying elite endurance athletes, and he's taking what he learns from these athletes in the study of their exercise physiology, and he's using that to figure out how they can better help people who get diabetes, cancer, insulin resistance, fatty liver disease. These are all big chronic health issues that are highly linked to mitochondrial dysfunction. Trained endurance athletes, this is one reason why running is so good for your long-term health. Trained endurance athletes have 2 times the density of mitochondria that a normal healthy person does. So it's super, super good for you. And we know that the reverse is true. When you have issues like diabetes, you have even less mitochondrial density. So having a good density of mitochondria is super, super important for having good ability to metabolize fuel. So back to VO2 max. So there are 2 ways that you can determine your VO2 max. Who here has a watch that you get that? Raise your hand. Okay, so you guys kind of pay attention to that number. Does it go up very easily? It's kind of a hard number to change. The watch is actually pretty good at predicting. So when I did my first VO2 max test with Dr. McNab, it was within like a point. So it's pretty accurate. It's within 5%. But the watch is not going to give you insight into your metabolism. So the purple and yellow bars are what. So if you guys got this little handout, you can kind of see what this is looking at. So purple is fat. So how much fat? So this is my first test with Dr. McNab. How much fat was I burning at each level of the test? So the heart rate is the x-axis there. So that was my heart rate at each of the levels. And if you follow the different stages on the sheet that I handed out, you can see kind of the miles per hour and then the incline that I was at. And at each of those stages, you're essentially getting a number called RER. So respiratory exchange ratio. You're looking at how much CO2 you breathe off relative to oxygen. And as you get closer, you can see in the table, as you get closer to a 1, that means you're using more glucose. Okay, so you can see as I got further and further into the test that my glucose usage went up. So my sugar usage went way up. So sugar is the yellow. So as I moved with more intensity, heart rate got higher, I was using more and more sugar. So that's what a lab test can tell you. It can tell you how good you are at your different heart rate zones of using fat and using sugar. Why should you care about this? Let's back up and talk about, what is metabolism. We've defined what VO2 max is, but what is metabolism? Metabolism is all the chemical reactions that occur in our bodies that help us fuel activities. So it's essentially taking a fuel source, glucose, fat, lactate we'll talk about a little bit later, but those are 3 big ones for endurance athletes. You're taking those fuel sources and you're turning it into usable energy so that you can do mechanical work. Okay, there it goes. So now this concept of metabolic flexibility. So one of the things that people always ask me as a physical therapist, they always feel bad that they don't stretch enough. So a lot of people think that you have to be super flexible to avoid injury. Well, we're not going to talk about that kind of flexibility today. We're going to talk about metabolic flexibility. So how good are you? Do you rely just on sugar to do
the things that you do, and that's super important. That's a really good predictor of your overall metabolic health, mitochondrial health. Is if you can use fuel sources other than sugar, that's a really good thing. So how flexible are you? This can be measured with VO2 max testing. So now just a little bit of cell physiology. So why should we be flexible with our metabolism? Being able to burn fat, being able to have a lot of purple on your graph when you do a VO2 max test is beneficial because it means your body is efficient with its fuel sources. So there's a lot more fat in our bodies than there is sugar.
So the sugar.
Endurance athletes can store a lot more sugar than someone who's untrained, but it's essentially for every pound of fat you have at least 400 grams of. For every pound of fat you have 400 grams of fat, and that's about how much glycogen an average person has stored in all of their muscles. So you have a lot more of it, and then you also have a lot more ability to produce ATP. So has anybody heard of ATP? Taken cell physiology in college, you'll know that is essentially the cellular currency for all the cells in your body. This is what you use to do work. So 100 ATP produced every time you burn through over 100 ATP you'll produce every time you burn through one molecule of fat. So it is a more efficient fuel source, and you want to be able to use it. For every molecule of glucose, of sugar you use in the presence of oxygen, so when you're doing work that's not super intense, you'll get 32 ATP. So 100 versus 32, which would you rather get? So that's why fat is such a good fuel source for endurance athletes. And then once you start really pushing, once you get to the far end of your curve, towards the end where it's all yellow and the yellow bars are super high, that's when you're working pretty hard. And once you get to that range, you're not going to last very long. When you get to that point, you're only getting 2 ATP per every sugar molecule that you're using. So you need to be able to use fuel on purple and yellow. So both colors are important. Yeah.
What does that mean? It means you have more power with the glucose and with fat.
So it just
slower.
Yeah. So it just means you basically get more. You get more bang for your buck out of burning a fat molecule than you do a glucose molecule. But burning fat is slower. So
because of the rate of burning, or because of the energy content?
Yes. So there's more carbon bonds in fat. Yeah, I think that's a good way. That's kind of what I put. So when you're in the purple, you're plugged into the wall. You're plugged into electricity. You've got a lot. That's why ultra runners they're running on purple most of their race, versus.
At the end, you're on battery power.
You get to pushing super hard and using lots of sugar, you've got a limited energy supply.
How does that tie in with?
So I'm going to get to that. I'll show you my latest race. So I have a slide on that. So yeah, we're gonna talk about zones too. Yeah, I've got slides for both of those things coming up. So this is a little bit of cell physiology detail, but I think it's important to see the numbers. So you see why it's beneficial to be able to use multiple different fuel sources. Okay, so here's another cool thing about VO2 max testing that you guys probably didn't know, is that you can actually tell the minute doc puts the mask on you how much glucose you're relying on just to do your daily activities. So one thing, I'm going to let you speak to this, but that he notices he can tell the difference between a fit person and an unfit person the second they put the mask on, if you want to speak to that a little bit. Well, okay, so you said that, so the RER, so people that are less fit start out at a higher RER. All right, we're going to move on here. Okay, so full circle, why do I care? Why do I care about this as a PT? And this is before I even did this test with Dr. McNab. I did this, I think, 2 years ago with him. Before I did that test, I I was convinced that most runners were doing way too much work in what I call the middle zone. So way too much work here in the middle where you're working too hard on all of your runs. Why do I care about that? Because that's stressful to the body. So this brings me to 80-20 running. Have anybody in here heard me talk about 80-20 running? Couple of you. So 80-20 running is based on the research of a guy named Dr. Steven Seiler. He's got his PhD, and he has spent his entire 30-year career studying the training habits of the most successful endurance athletes in the world. And what he has found in his research is that there's this very clear pattern that the most successful endurance athletes have 80% of their training volume spent at these lower training zones, so burning fat. 20% spent at their higher training zones, relying more on sugar. They had this split. They do spend some time in the middle zone, but not very much. And after I read that book, I thought, injuries in runners are a major problem. There's a lot of things that play into why someone develops a running injury, and I really feel like this is a very big reason. I think a lot of people just spend way too much time spending all their time running in this middle zone. So the research that led me, back to this is my graph. I started doing 80-20 running myself after I had my 7-year-old. I got back into running. I had some really, really good results from this. I found that when I did the 80-20 running, for me, even before I did this test, I was staying right around 140 or a little bit lower with my heart rate, which is right on with where I should be with this test. I found that when I did most of my runs at this lower heart rate zone, I used to let myself drift up in the 150s on a lot of my runs. I backed off a little bit, and what that enabled me to do was run more volume. I was able to run a lot more mileage. And then on my hard days, I still did 20% of my workouts hard. I was able to do higher volume on my harder days, and get better success with my training. And I saw some really, really good results with that. I didn't get injured. So I think there's something to the 80-20 training because it's sustainable. So when you are choosing your hard days to stay hard and your easy days to stay easy, I think it's sustainable, and I think you're much less likely to get injured.
And it stood the test.
Successful endurance athletes in the world. So how did I even come across this 80-20 training research? I actually learned about this through the research of another researcher called, his name's Tim Gabbett. He's got a paper out called The Athlete's Injury Prevention Paradox. And it's a really good paper. The premise of it is that the key to injury prevention is actually that you need to be training smarter and harder and not less. You're not getting injured because you're training. It's because you need to be smarter with what you're doing, and you need to actually be preparing yourself to have the physical traits that you need to do the competition that you're preparing for. Based on his research, we know that the highest injury risk that an athlete is going to have is when they have big spikes in their acute to chronic workload ratios. There's a lot of research that supports that. So failure to maintain good year-round baseline fitness, which is your chronic workload volume, is going to set you up for injury. The training that you do needs to be sustainable year after year, and the 80-20 training really seems to be the key to this sustainability. I threw in this slide because this is something that I'm super passionate about. Is this idea that do we really need to completely rest when we get injured, or should we take this same mindset about maintaining a certain amount of metabolic flexibility and metabolic fitness by cross training? So you might not be able to do the pounding of running, but can we work in our fat burning zone doing biking? Can we do things that's going to give us that aerobic base that we need while we're injured? And then if we can't run hard, can we cross train with strength training? So I'm super passionate about getting runners to add strength training into their training, because I think it's a great way. You're still, like when you strength train, you're still getting your heart rate up. You're still producing lactate, which is one thing you do. When you're doing a hard run, you're also doing that whenever you're doing strength training. So I think just having this, this big picture view of when you're working out, you're really just trying to improve your metabolism, your ability to use these different fuel sources. I think that's kind of an important mindset that we should have as runners when we're injured. Okay, so why should you care as a runner? One of the biggest hurdles I've had over the years of trying to convince runners to do 80-20 training is buying into the idea of slowing down on the easy runs. That's really, really hard to convince people to do. I think if you have this picture of you really want to just improve your metabolic flexibility, you want to improve your ability to use fat for fuel, I think focusing on that may help you kind of grasp that a little bit more, and care a little bit less about your pace and a little bit more about your heart rate zones, which is
Next with this.
Of metabolic flexibility, understanding how you burn different fuels. It will help with pacing strategies during races and workouts, and then place the focus more on overall long-term health and sustainable fitness goals. Okay, so pacing was what we talked about. I can't remember who asked the question about the pacing in races. So I think when you have an understanding of your zones, which is where we're going next, I think you can use this to get better at pacing. I no longer really care what my watch says about how fast I went and how far I went. I'm super excited if I can have a heart rate graph that looks like this at the end. If I can come to the race and race to my full physiological potential, that's what I care most about. So for me, this was my last trail run. It took me an hour 50 minutes. It was super hard. Dogwood Canyon, anybody done that one? Super hilly. So it's a different style of racing. So I had a lot of spikes and a lot of drops in my heart rate. But on a long race, any kind of a race for me that lasts longer than an hour and a half, I start out the race harder than I would an easy run. So we're going to get into the zone. So zone 2 is where you're doing a little bit of sugar burning and a little bit of fat burning. Sorry, zone 3, I apologize. Zone 3, you're doing sugar burning and fat burning, but you're starting to use a lot more sugar. So I usually try to race harder than I do my easy runs. When I'm doing my easy runs, I'm down in zone 2 where I'm using more fat. But I'll start out my race, if I'm fit, I'll start out in zone 3, and then I get into my zone 4, which is the red arrow. That's where you're starting to use mostly all sugar. If I'm fit, I'll let myself do that in the last 30 to 40 minutes because I know I've got that capacity to do so. And then if I pace it really well, the last 5 to 10 minutes of that race, I can get pretty close to my max heart rate. So that's always my goal that I have when I go into a race is I want to be able to get to that max heart rate because I know I used my fuel sources really well. So I think learning your zones and learning the importance of staying in fat burning mode when you need to stay in fat burning mode, I think that will help pull you through your races better. Yes. That's the next slide. Yeah. We're gonna talk about that. Yeah. So it's a couple things. When you get up into the zone 4, zone 5, you're also producing a fuel source called lactate. So lactate, it turns out there's a lot of health benefits to being able to clear lactate as well. And I think that's what when you look at your most elite runners, none of
Become super elite.
the really high VO2 max, what gets them better is their ability to clear lactate. So the importance of being able to go in your zone 4 and 5, which is the yellow, is that your body learns how to use lactate as a fuel source. So that's metabolic flexibility. More competitive runner talking, but
because let's say you were just a hobbyist runner. You ran like 5 days a week at like 5 a.m. or whatever. Would you still want to do that 20%, or would you just stay in zone
So the staying in the top end is going to help more with the raising, if you have a low VO2 max. Like, so if Dr. McNab will show you some examples of patients who they're okay at burning fuel, but they have a terrible VO2 max for their age. Like, they're super low. So those are the people that are going to want to spend maybe more than 20% of the time working in those higher zones, because that's going to raise the capacity of your engine. So if you have a low VO2 max, yes, that's important. And
As a PT,
in those higher zones as well, because it's going to get runners specifically pace variety. So like if you run the same pace all the time, even though it's slower, it's good to develop different muscles, shift the stress of running to other places in the body. So the pace variety from an injury prevention standpoint, I think is important as well. So I think not doing even if you are all purple for all your runs, I think you still need to do a little bit of speed for that reason as well. Okay, so question of how do you determine your max heart rate? So to know your zones, I kept talking about zones. To know your zones, you have to know your max heart rate. Who has heard the formula 220 minus age? Okay, so that works for some people, but for some people it works terrible. Some people tend to run really low on they'd feel like their heart rate was way too high based on this formula. They tend to run on the low end of a heart rate. And there's some people that are really high and they're like, oh man, is my heart going to blow out of my chest? It's getting so high. Not everyone follows that 220 minus age. So that's where you have to do a little bit of a field test on yourself. I think there's a lot of ways to do this to find your max heart rate. A couple things that I think are pretty practical to try if you're really wanting to know your max heart rate. You want to have a good warm-up in. I think that at the end of if you're doing a field test, you have a good warm-up, 2 by 4 minutes hard with 2 minutes recovery between. And then on the last 4-minute hard push, you want to go the last 2 minutes as fast as you possibly can. So that's one way. If you wanted to really find your max heart rate, that's a test you could do for yourself. You could do a 1 mile race 1 mile run at a 5K pace and then build to max effort in the last quarter mile. So that's another option. And then if you push really hard and you pace really well on a 5K, I think you can get pretty close to your max at the end of a 5K. So there's different ways that you can do it, but max heart rate is essentially at the end of a really hard workout. Check your watch and see if what the highest it is, and that's probably true for, I don't know, is it half the population 220? I know there's some statistics for that. And it does go down as you age, right? Is that a little bit? Yeah.
It shocks me. I can get the flabbiest from on there, and they can like I'm so impressed with I'm 53, and I'm like,
yeah.
I can't do that. That is a fun truck, and I can get up into the 180. Pretty good about myself. These kids.
Yeah. So it will change a little bit over the years, but I think it stays pretty stable. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So knowing your max heart rate is actually really key to finding these zones. So what are the zones? Let's define them. So the 80-20 running, I used to call these, so 80% easier runs, I called those green days, so green workouts. So green workouts are your zone 1 and zone 2. So in zone 1, you should be mostly fat burning. Zone 2, zone 2 is really, really important. So there's a lot of doctors like Dr. McNab who are interested in getting all of their patients to do a good amount of zone 2 workout during their week, because there's a ton of health benefits to spending time in this zone. This zone is defined as the maximum fat usage. So when you go back to my curve, let me go back to, there we go. So my zone 2 is right here. So where the purple bars are the highest, that's my zone 2. 136 to 140 is kind of the heart rate range that I use on my easy days. I want to stay in that range because I know I'm burning fat well in that range. So zone 2 is important because that's where the purple bar is going to be the highest. And that's where lactate, so as you get into this zone 2, you're still using a little bit of yellow. When the glucose is used, you're also producing lactate. So this is actually a zone where you've got fast twitch fibers and slow twitch fibers. This is a zone where these two fibers get to kind of work together. There's less mitochondria in fast twitch fibers, so all the lactate that gets produced in these fast twitch, more fatigable muscle fibers gets transferred and passed over to your slow twitch fibers. So this is an important zone for training that as well. So that's another concept of metabolic flexibility. You're learning to use lactate and fat well by spending time in zone 2. How do you know if you're in zone 2 if you don't know your heart rate zone? A good thing is a talk test. So in zone 2, you should be able to talk, but it's a little bit taxing to do so. How do you explain zone 2 to your patients? So long run should definitely be done in this zone. And zone 2, so I'm a big fan of run walk. So if you're a runner, it doesn't mean you have to run the whole time you're out there. A lot of people, to stay in their zone 2, need to do run walk, and it's actually more beneficial to do that because you're going to be burning a more efficient fuel source. So just don't have to run the whole time, especially if it means you're going to stay in your zone 2. That tends to fall for most people within 70 to 80% of your maximum heart rate. That's why knowing your max is super important. So this one other thing about this graph that I want to point out, the black line is a lactate curve. So lactate, who's heard of lactic acid? Okay, so lactic acid, we know the more of it's really lactate plus hydrogen, which is why we call it lactic acid. As that goes up, as lactate starts spilling into the blood, it turns out that is when we start getting more and more and more tired. So there's what's called 2 lactate turn points. So lactate turn point 1 and lactate turn point 2. The top of your zone 2 is where lactate starts spilling a little bit more into the blood. And so that's why you get more and more tired as you go through these zones. So once you get into zone 3, that's when lactate starts going up just a little bit more. This is called the transition zone. So this is really your steady state. I'm sure you guys have heard steady state before. This is where your heart rate can stay pretty stable. That's mostly because lactate doesn't rise a whole lot here. But this is an important zone too, because this is again where you're learning to use lactate as fuel. This is a good zone to be at when you're doing longer hard runs. So longer tempo runs, progressive runs where you start out slower and then build faster. This is a good place to be for that zone 3. So these are the 20%. So the red, I call these the red zone workout days. Zone 3 is really in that 20% category. So when you do those types of runs, that's kind of where you want to bucket this type of a workout. Zone 4 for competitive runners is really where a lot of improvements are made. A lot of the really elite runners, they do well trying to spend as much time possible on their hard days at the low end of zone 4 because they tend to get more volume in at that level. So this tends to be 87 to 92% of your max heart rate. And then zone 5 is when you get close to your max, and this is when you're using all glucose. So ideally with training, you learn to use more fat in your zone 3 and zone 4, and that's where you're going to get better. So just to kind of simplify this, I think you can do this. Steven Seiler, the guy who came up with 80-20 training, has just tried to simplify this for people, and he calls it, you've got high stress days and you've got low stress days.
High stress days is where.
And this is important for developing your overall strength. It's important for neuromuscular control. So as you get older, you lose function in your fast twitch fibers. So it is important to train fast twitch fibers. And these are the types of workouts that are going to help you do that. It doesn't have to be running either. So like I said, you can do, I think biking, hard workouts on the bike are really, really beneficial, especially if you tend to break down with injury easily. And then strength training. So strength training can fall into this category as well. I'm sure you guys have heard CrossFit athletes use the term metabolic conditioning. So that's kind of what this is. So this is metabolic conditioning for runners. It doesn't have to be running hard, but it can be. So those are high stress days. And then low stress days is where you need to spend 80% of your time. And that's when you're really working on improving the function of your mitochondria. We know with that type of training, like if you were to take a biopsy of your muscle, those mitochondria just grow and grow and grow and grow, and your capacity to utilize fat just goes up and up and up. So high stress days, low stress days. Some high stress workout examples. Who on here does some form of speed work? Ish. Yeah. Speed work. Used to? Okay. So some example workouts. There's something, I don't know, Matt, there's something powerful about the 4x4. So there's a lot of research that shows you can make some good improvements in your VO2 max if you do 4x4 minutes hard. And that's one that I use quite a bit. There's also another type of workout called micro intervals. Those are really popular. That's where you're doing really short, hard bouts of work with really short recovery periods, and you're just doing that over and over and over again. And the goal is to get that sequence built up to 4-minute bouts. So the one work bout should last about 4 minutes, and then you want to build up to where you're doing the 4x4, but with the micro intervals. There's another type of workout that Ryan introduced me to. So double thresholds is something that a lot of high-level runners are starting to do. They're choosing a day to have a more stressful day, where they're doing an interval session in the morning, and then another tempo or another interval session in the afternoon. So you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've never done this. Yeah, because I'm coming off knee surgery. Love like top program. I ran Missouri Southern, so I'm like policy, but love the top like colleges and pros. They do morning. They'll do like 5 by 6 minutes, but keeping it at like zone 4, which is threshold zone. And afternoon they'll come back. They'll do like 10 by 1K, in that lower zone, like threshold zone, where it's not like a killer workout, but you're still getting into like solid work. But it's like able to like teach your body how to like get rid of the like. Really. And
results with that type of workout. So I think that they found that like when you keep your if you're going to have a stressful day, you keep it all on the same day, it's easier to recover from. And then also they're choosing to go, it's okay to go a little bit slower on your hard days, but get more volume. I think that's kind of what they're finding, and they're finding big benefit in staying a little bit lower on the lower end of your hard zones so that you can tolerate more and be more injury resistant. So recommended rest intervals. This came from Dr. Seiler's research. He has done a lot of studies on like when you are doing a high stress workout, how much recovery do you really need? 2 to 3 minutes seems to be kind of the magic range. You don't get a whole lot more benefit out of resting more than 2 to 3 minutes between your intervals. If you can't recover in 2 to 3 minutes, it probably means you're pushing too hard. So I think that's a good rule of thumb. If you can't get all your intervals in with that much recovery, you're pushing too hard. Yes.
So does that mean like on your 4x4, you're gonna
But, yes. Yeah.
and if I recover, are you walking?
Yeah, you can do so. You can do whatever it takes to get your heart rate down. When I'm doing really hard 4x4 work, I'll just rest. I'll just stand there. I think it depends on how hard you push. If you're on the lower end of your zone 4, you might do a jog between. Do you jog, don't you, Ryan?
I use it.
Yeah. So I think it depends on how fit you are and then how hard you push during the interval. If you're pushing pretty hard, I think you just need to stand there and rest. But it's 2 minutes, 2 to 3. Sometimes I let myself have 3 if I'm really tired, but try to do no more than that. And then sometimes, if you really want to build your volume doing intervals, you can throw in a little extra 4-minute recovery. So sometimes I will do a 2 by 4 minutes with the 2-minute recovery, 4 minutes in the middle, and then do 2 more. So sometimes you can just throw in that extra little 4-minute recovery and exercise physiologists call that resetting your W prime. So all that's doing is just helping you kind of restore the energy in your fast twitch fibers. So the 4-minute rest in the middle of a hard workout is a good strategy as well. Dosage. So how often should you be doing these things? I think it's good for runners to be doing at least 1 time a week, a harder workout, whether that's hard running, hard biking, hard strength training. I think you need to be doing that 1 to 2 times a week. And then dosage of low stress workouts. In you go, San Milan. He's the researcher who studies a lot about mitochondria. He was the coach of Pogacar, the cyclist that won the Tour de France. He recommends that you do, just to maintain your overall mitochondrial health, that you do strict zone 2 work for 1 hour.
The time twice a week.
Health over your lifespan. 3 to 4 times a week, though, he says, based on the lab studies he does with his patients, that's kind of the magical dosage that you want for if you really want to improve your ability to use fat as fuel and just to improve your overall mitochondrial health. Peter Attia, he's another guy. He's the guy who did the interview on the podcast that I listened to for this coach. He's got a really good book out called Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity. It's got a lot of really good stuff in there. He recommends that for his patients that they do 3 1-hour sessions each week of strict zone 2 or 4 45-minute sessions each week of strict zone 2.